Hello, BookTube. This is the John Carter series read-along announcement, and this is a read-along created by Mike over at Pints and Paperbacks, a new channel to me. Wonderful channel. I'm having fun catching up with his stuff. Pints, and this one actually is 16 ounces, so I'm doing all right. And we have a few other folks, some who I've worked with before and some who I have not. One who I have not and is new to me is Scott over at Book Invasion. I've watched a few of his videos, enjoyed them very much. He tends to do them in his car, which I find enjoyable to watch. So, and then we have Steve Donoghue. And we have Matt over at Paperback Junkie. Matt is someone that started pretty close on BookTube the same time I did. And so this should be great. So it's John Carter of Mars, a creation of Edgar Rice Burroughs, right? And many of you will know Edgar Rice Burroughs from Tarzan of the Apes, a very famous character in fiction. And then all sorts of Edgar Rice Burroughs stories. He was a big name writer still. He had passed away, but he was a big name. Here, let me get some of this light out of here. This is just getting a little frustrating. I have tried to film this. I'm not going to tell you how many times. Something's gone wrong each time. But, so I have been reading Edgar Rice Burroughs for, the way I tried to calculate it, it's at least 50 years. At least 50 years. First with some of the Tarzan stories, and then that I'd find lying around that I could get my hands on. And then John Carter of Mars. And I love John Carter of Mars, and I love the whole Barsoom. Barsoom is the name for the planet. And I've been reading them for a long time. I started off with Edgar Rice Burroughs, who is from the early part of the 20th century, with Tarzan television show, and movies, and comic books, and everything. He was everywhere. Still has a pretty decent presence after all this time. So we're talking more than a century, which is a pretty good run for any writer. So I'm going to start by talking about the influence of Edgar Rice Burroughs and the Mars connection. Now, don't forget, this is very, very early writing, long before space flight. Astronomy was working with problems that they've passed beyond. I mean, we can get more detail about Mars because we can put satellites around it now, right? We can get there. That was not the case when these stories were written, so the imagination had to fill the void, which is a wonderful thing. So I'm going to read, this is a little bit from Arthur C. Clarke, Greeting Carbon-Based Bipeds, a wonderful collection of his nonfiction pieces, occasional pieces. And this this was written, it's called Mars in the Mind of Man. So in November 12, 1971, the space probe Mariner 9, some of you remember that, arrived at Mars, went into orbit, and commenced taking a series of photographs that over the next few months revolutionized our knowledge of the planet. So 1971, Burroughs died in like 1950 or something, so it's long after he's passed, and long after these stories were written. The day before, a panel discussion was arranged at Caltech. It included Ray Bradbury, the author of Martian Chronicles, Carl Sagan, the legendary host of Cosmos and a famous scientist, Bruce Murray, who was the director of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and Arthur C. Clarke. most famous probably for 2001: A Space Odyssey, but I love his book Childhood's End and many of his others. When, a year later, they had an opportunity to examine the results of the mission, they wrote afterthoughts that resulted in Mars in the Mind of Man. The passage that follows contains Clarke's unrehearsed remarks at Caltech. And then there's an afterthought section, which I'm not going to get into. And here he says, I want to go along with Ray Bradbury's views on the importance of Edgar Rice Burroughs. It was Burroughs who turned me on, and I think he is a much underrated writer. The man who can create Tarzan, the best-known character in the whole of fiction, should not be taken too lightly. Of course, there's not much left of his Mars, and his science was always rather dubious. I can still remember, even as a boy, feeling there was something a little peculiar about cliffs of solid gold studded with gems. I think it might be an interesting exercise for a geology student to see how that phenomenon could be brought about. Yes, the science is not the science of 1971, and it certainly is not the science of 2020. So, why are we reading it? Well, basically we're reading them because they're great stories. Obviously influence way more than just Arthur C. Clarke and Ray Bradbury. I mean, Kim Stanley Robinson with Red Mars, Blue Mars, and what was it, Green Mars? Wonderful novels. All of them the Mars stories, really, I mean, with Edgar Rice Burroughs, and you'd have to give also a lot of that. More of the on Mars stuff would be Edgar Rice Burroughs. Of course, Invasion from Mars, you would have to look to H.G. Wells, right? So, when did this stuff happen? Well, Edgar Rice Burroughs was the son of a Civil War veteran. His father had done well, the family had done well, and Edgar, it was a military tradition family, and he did not get into West Point. I think he went to a military academy in Michigan. Banged around a bit, as writers often do. And banged around so much that you almost wondered if he was ever going to succeed. He got married early, and then around 1912, well, it was 1912, he was looking at magazines, pulp magazines. So a pulp magazine was a magazine, I think it was Muncie was one of the great innovators in that, where he figured this story could be printed on cheap pulp paper, a real coarse paper with a lot of tannin from the pulp and a lot of these chemicals that break down paper easily. You've seen it with like newspapers that discolor things. They get a tobacco color to them after a while because they have so much acid in them. You'll see in modern books a lot of the times they'll say acid-free. It's been treated. So he decided he was going to print these magazines, and he could print them cheaper than the Slick. So the Slick, the good paper magazines, which would sell in the millions maybe, they have huge runs because they're really important and they were on better paper, might cost a quarter, where a pulp could cost maybe a dime, right? And you mostly would find it on a newsstand as opposed to delivered in your post office box. And these, so you're on cheaper paper, you don't have to take in as much money to pay for these things and to make a profit. And so you also could specialize, right? You're not going to have the broad appeal of a Slick. So you could do mysteries, cowboys, a more modern fantasy. That's where H.P. Lovecraft started. You could do science fiction. We had Hugo Gernsback and the rise of all of that scientification. I'm trying to say that. Probably everybody in the world can say it but me. But you get my point. You could niche, tend to have garish covers, beautiful cover art. You're on a newsstand now. you've got to attract that buyer, right, for that dime. And so they tended to have very interesting, bold, artistic covers. And if you become a connoisseur of these stories, it's a great, fun thing to look into, and you'll get to know the artist's name. Damsels in distress on the covers, wild-looking aliens, heroic cowboys, detectives, and it's great visual fun. You can find collections of that art. So Edgar Rice Burroughs sends off a story in Wisdom Muncie's, and 1912, and that story is what is going to be our first novel. Now, it wasn't a novel to start with, but it's about our character, which is John Carter, a Civil War veteran, a gentleman from Virginia. And I've got some of these books that are sort of like, almost like this Arthur C. Clarke, because Burroughs is easy to track because he had such a huge influence. So this was a gift for my wife. It focuses on Tarzan, but of course they can't get past the start, and the start is a Princess of Mars, but it didn't quite, it's a little more complicated than that. So in 1912, so it's a Frank A. Munsey company, is where Burroughs sends his first half of his manuscript to their New York City address. He wasn't very sophisticated at this to start with, which is not unusual. And they bought something called Deja Thoris, Martian Princess for $400, which was a good chunk of change back then, right? So they were impressed. So that would be worth, the book here is saying, several months of average wages, right? And it was published as Under the Moons of Mars in 6 monthly installments in All Story magazine. This is one of these pulps. And then, but Burroughs playfully sends it in under a pseudonym, and it's called, he's Normal Bean. An editor thought it was Norman Bean, and then eventually when things worked out, it becomes Edgar Rice Burroughs. So it was retitled The Princess of Mars for book publication, and this swashbuckling tale relates adventures of John Carter, a Confederate cavalry veteran and gentleman from Virginia, who is mystically transported to Barsoom on Mars. So this would be an image. Let me see if I can get it for you here, right here, when it becomes a book. And then, so this is 1912. I want to give you an idea what's going on in 1912. So if you're from New Mexico, that's when you would already know that, was when your state was the 47th state admitted to the Union. Arizona, the 48th. The Girl Scouts of the United States were founded. The cherry trees were donated by the mayor of Tokyo to Washington, D.C. The Titanic sinks, taking 1,500 lives. That's an amazing thing to think about. Fenway Park, home of the Boston Red Sox, open, as does Tiger Stadium in Detroit. Let's see. The Boston Red Sox defeat the New York Giants to win the World Series. I'd like to reiterate that. The Boston Red Sox defeat the New York Giants to win the World Series. And this is fun. Democrat Woodrow Wilson wins the White House. Teddy Roosevelt comes in second, and some fella named William Howard Taft places third. Maybe Steve Donoghue knows who he is. Just saying. And let's see if we have any notable births. Would be Gene Kelly, Lady Bird Johnson, Julia Child, the famous chef. So yeah, great fun. Here's a cover of All Story, but with the Tarzan of the Apes. Let's see if I can do this without damaging the book. So some of this art is great to get into, right? But of course, we're saying that this first story showed up in All Story, and I've got an image. This is Edgar Rice Burroughs, The Man Who Created Tarzan, by Erwin Porges. Wonderful volume. Again, something my wife got for me. And this is, here's the great man himself. Wonderful illustrations in here. And this is, let's see if we get a date. I don't see it. So I'm not going to look all, nobody cares, right? You can look it up online. So I wanted you to see what that story from February 1912 looked like when it was in the magazine. And if you look right here on this side, that's what it would have been. All right. So, and you can see where it says the author's name. Right there. Norman Bean. So that's the beginning of his success. So if you go to Tarzana, California, that's Edgar Rice Burroughs. Movie. I mean, the pop culture phenomenon that he initiated in some ways is just beyond belief. So we're going to read these books once a month. I don't know exactly how we're going to do the presentations. There's some discussion amongst us about that. The two gentlemen, Mike and Scott, know a heck of a lot more about the technology than I do, and I imagine Steve and Matt also do, so I'll follow the four of them. I'll follow their lead. I will be reading, unless I can find, which I would love to do, is find some paperback copies of Edgar Rice Burroughs. That's a way to read them. I do like these copies I have. This one here. I mean, I've had them so many times, and they do take a beating. This one has Fighting Men of Mars, Swords of Mars, Synthetic Men of Mars. I'm missing one volume that this combined things. This one here, these are all science fiction book club volumes, but they're, this one has Thuvia, Maid of Mars, Chessmen of Mars, The Mastermind of Mars. And then the one that will have the story we're going to start with right here, of course, has that wonderful title, Under the Moon of Mars. And it has Princess of Mars, Gods of Mars, and the Warlord of Mars. These are book club's editions, but they are from the University of Nebraska Press, Lincoln and Logan volumes. And it's introduced by James P. Hogan, a science fiction writer some of you will know. Illustration by Scott Beechler. So here you go. The Hogan introduction is quite good. He didn't grow up with Edgar Rice Burroughs as an American would of his generation, but that actually gives him some sort of interesting insights in the intro. So like I say, we will do further follow-up on how we're going to present this. I hope these things are, for the most part, in the public domain. You can go to Project Gutenberg. You can go to many places to get them. You can listen to them on audiobook. There's been John Carter movies, comic books. There's tons of things you can do to look at them. And if you're going to look at them or read them or even have them in a different media or format, love to hear about it. I appreciate the fact that my co-hosts invited me along for this journey, this adventure, and I'm very, very much looking forward to it. So, like I say, 50 years of reading this stuff has got a reason why I think it has staying power, and it's for this sheer pleasure. It's just a joy to read. So I hope you join us, and thank you, BookTube.